I'd like to introduce to you tonight Jenny Laxton, Education Manager at the Mount Pisgah Arboretum, for her talk on slimy creatures. These underappreciated critters, however goopy and drippy and yucky they are more fascinating than you've ever imagined. So break out your inner kid and examine our local slime creators with fresh eyes. Lions, tigers, and bears have nothing on the weird and wacky world of these charismatic critters. Jenny has been teaching kids and adults about the outdoors for 15 years. She has an undergrad degree in environmental studies from the U of O and currently works at Mount Pisgah Arboretum as education manager. And she grew up in Oregon and enjoys helping people forge a greater connection to their small part of the world. And she agrees that her 2- and 4-year-olds, that the gross things in life are the most fun. And with that, let's welcome Jenny.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight. You guys are a lively crowd. It's great. The trivia questions were awesome. The last time I talked into a microphone, there was a lot of squealing involved, so I'm a little scared. So I'm crossing my fingers that I don't get too close over there, so there's no squealing. So, slimy creatures like this lovely slime mold. This is our dog vomit slime mold right over here. That was one of our trivia questions. I didn't really get into them until I started doing nature walks with kids. I mostly ignored the slimy things like a lot of us do. And then I found when I was doing nature walks with like groups of 6 to 15 kids that it's basically like a herd of elephants walking through the forest. They tend to be very loud, and all of the animals were long gone by the time we got there. And the only thing that was left were things like worms and slugs and snails and maybe newts, things that were maybe desperately trying to get away but just aren't very fast. And so I started looking up info about them because I wanted to have something to say when we found them with the kids. And the more I learned about them, the more I realized how fascinating these little guys are. And here I am right here, licking the banana slug, which is, I know, right? Which, if you've ever done like outdoor school or summer camp, this is kind of a rite of passage here in the Northwest, the licking of the banana slug. And we'll talk about why. Why would you do that? A little later in the presentation. Yeah. So my hope at the end of the presentation is that you might not love slugs enough to go make out with them at the end, but that hopefully the next slug or worm you see, your first thought might be, oh, that's gross. But hopefully your second thought after this presentation will be, oh, it's very interesting. So first off, what is not a slimy creature? Let's get those out of the way. So reptiles, snakes, lizards, these are not slimy. A lot of times people think that they're slimy, maybe because snakes slither, I don't know. But if you've ever held a snake or a lizard, you will know that it's very smooth and pretty dry. So these are the non-slimy things that sometimes get mistaken for slimy things that are out there. Amphibians, though, are a little bit slimy. They're not a really slimy creature like some of the other ones we'll talk about later, but they are a little slimy. They're always a little moist, and that's because they actually breathe through their skin. So they do have lungs and noses, just like us, and breathe that way, but they also can do some breathing through their skin, and that's why their skin has to stay moist, so that they can do that extra breathing action through their skin. And amphibians, go through metamorphosis, which is that cool thing where they start out in the water and eventually turn into an adult frog or a salamander, and they look totally different. So in the water, they have gills, and then they slowly develop lungs and legs, and they start living on the land as an adult. So the top one there is a tadpole that's gotten its back legs, so that's some kind of frog. And then this bottom critter that's not showing up that well, but it's actually a salamander larva. So they have gills on the outsides of their heads. There's kind of frilly looking, and that's how you know it's for a salamander or newt and not a frog. but they're also living in the water. Our Pacific tree frog are our little frogs that you hear more than you see. They camouflage and blend in really well. They're all over the place. Right now especially, I'm hearing them constantly calling. Anytime you hear, here's one doing its little call during the night. Anytime you are like watching a movie and there's frogs in the background, it's almost always the Pacific tree frog that they're using on audio. Even if the movie is like made somewhere completely different, they just have a great frog sound. And, They are native. Yeah, these are native. They also can change their color, which is something that's pretty cool about them. Not like a chameleon can. They can't control it, but based on humidity in the air and the temperature, their skin will change color. So kind of in the fall, they often have a more brownish color so that they blend in better in the fall, and then in the spring, they're often more green. There's also some really cool pictures you can find online of them where they're almost white or black because they've been hanging out in areas that are recently burned. So their skin really changes a lot. And here's the egg mass for them. They're very small little egg masses, and they usually lay their eggs in like puddles by parking lots and stuff. And there's the little tadpoles that hatch out. And the cool thing about these tadpoles is that they can actually fast forward metamorphosis. So if the puddle they're in starts to dry out, they can actually turn into an adult frog faster, so that they can hopefully hop out before the puddle dries up. So that's why sometimes you find little Pacific tree frogs that are adults, but they are tiny. And it's probably because they were in a puddle that just started, like the water was gone, and so they had to go really fast. So here's an amphibian that is not native, bullfrogs. They are all over in ponds and creeks and rivers around here. And they were actually introduced into the Northwest for eating, for frog legs. And that didn't really take off around here. They're from the south of the United States, and they were kind of just let loose after the frog leg thing didn't work out so well. So now they're everywhere, and they eat a lot of our native frogs, unfortunately, like the little tree frogs and our red-legged frogs and stuff. Frogs are very susceptible to pollution, and amphibians are on the decline all over the world, partially because they breathe through their skin. They can take in a lot of poisons and pesticides and stuff through their skin because their skin's more porous than ours is. Bullfrogs have also been known, so instead of like sending out a tongue to grab a fly and bring it back in, bullfrogs kind of can unhinge their jaws and just swallow things whole. And they've been known to swallow like baby ducklings, like much bigger things than you would imagine. Like they can get big, but they just like open their mouth and that duck is gone. Rough-skinned newts are native, and we have tons of different kinds of salamanders and newts in the Northwest, but you don't see a lot of them because most of them are nocturnal. But the rough-skinned newts are actually out during the day frequently, and on rainy days you'll see them wandering through the forest. They're very slow going, and part of the reason they're so slow is because they're very poisonous, so they really don't have to worry about predators very much. The only thing that can eat them without dying is a gardener snake. They're immune to the poison. Otherwise, anything else that eats this is going to die, including people, and there have been cases of people eating rough-skinned newts, mostly on dares, often after drinking alcohol. So I didn't bring any newts here today, just to be on the safe side. Newts and bars don't mix. And what they'll do is that orange color is their warning sign that they're poisonous. So the bright colors usually are a warning of things being poisonous, and so they'll raise up their head and show their head and their neck and underbelly to something, and that's their warning, like, hey, don't eat me, I will kill you. So this time of year, the newts are mostly mating in waterways, and the males actually do this thing. They spend like about 2 to 3 months in the water, and the females sort of come and go, and their tail actually changes. It gets longer and really wide And newts often have this pebbly look to their back, and that gets smooth as they hang out in the water for a long time. So the shape of the males totally changes as they're living in the water, and then after breeding season is over, they go back into the forest, and their tail gets less wide and thinner again, and they get that pebbly look on their skin again, which is kind of cool. So worms are another of our slimy creatures, and this one is more slimy. They actually have quite a bit of slime. Worms are invertebrates, so they don't have bones, which is useful if you're living most of your life under the ground and kind of bumping into rocks and stuff. There's less that can break, right? They're also part of the phylum, the annelids, which means like ringed or segmented. So you can see on this little worm that it's got all these little tiny rings on it, and that means it's part of that group. So the majority of things in that phylum actually live in the ocean. So here are some bristle worms, and you can see, same thing, they've still got the segments, but there's over like 9,000 different kinds of worms, and the vast majority of them live in the water, not on the land. So worms are part of the class clitellates, and they're named after the clitellum. So on earthworms, there's this little band that sometimes kids will call the Band-Aid of the worm, and that's the clitellum, and that's important for breeding for worms. They're also kind of hairless. So those bristle worms that we saw before had all these little setae or bristles on their side. Our earthworms are sort of naked worms. They still have those little hairs, but they're very minuscule and you can't really see them. Another thing that's part of that same group that's also a clitellate are leeches. So leeches are like earthworm cousins, and they're another slimy thing. Most leeches in the world do suck blood, but not all of them. And most of the leeches that we have here in the Northwest, and in North America in general actually, are freshwater leeches, and most of those don't suck blood. So they're actually spending most of their time eating, they're like detritivores. So they're eating like little bits of plants and stuff that fall in the water, dead animals, that kind of stuff. So they're sort of the cleanup crew for ponds. So here, when you see a little tiny leech, you don't really have to worry about it. It's not gonna suck your blood. That's not what it eats. So earthworms, like one of our trivia questions said, Darwin wrote a whole book about earthworms. So people have been very fascinated by earthworms for a long time, for a lot of good reasons. And what we're gonna do is actually pass out, if you would like, some worms for you to look at your table. So we'll kind of go through some of the different body parts of the worm, and you guys can look at your very own live worm and see if you can find the parts. So maybe, I didn't expect such a big crowd, so.
Distributing worms, ma'am.
I have some help. My lovely assistant over here, Russ, is going to be helping. So as they're passing out the worms, people often ask, so does the worm have a head and a tail? It does. It does have a head end and a tail end. So there is a mouth at one side and the anus or the butt at the other side of the worm. They don't really have teeth. They kind of just swallow things whole. And then on the middle somewhere you'll see the clitellum. And on some worms the clitellum is really obvious, and in some worms it's harder to find, but it is there. And basically you know where the head of your worm is by where the clitellum is. So the clitellum is near the head of your worm. They usually move head first, but they can go backwards too, so you can't always go by the direction that the worm's going. Yeah. They have a what? Sorry? Oh, a pair of kidneys per segment? You know, I'm not sure about that. I know that they do have, so they have the 5 hearts, which are up at the top, and they have a whole bunch of little pores for slime on each segment, but the kidney is not one that I don't know the answer to that one. So basically there's one long digestive tract. So the worms eat stuff and poop it out, right? They're pretty simple creatures. And there is the idea that worms eat soil, eat dirt. They don't really eat the dirt. They're eating the stuff in the dirt. So what they're really going after are the plants and the leaves and maybe dead animals or something that have fallen into the soil. That's what they're trying to eat. And once they swallow that, that is going to go through a gizzard. So worms have a gizzard just like birds do. They actually, which is like a little thing that has tiny little stones in it, and that basically grinds up the food. Because they don't have teeth for chomping, they just swallow it whole, and it grinds up in the gizzard and then goes through them. And then they poop out castings, which are great fertilizer. Oh yeah, and then the hearts are up at the top too. So if you look at a worm, this is the head end of the worm, because there's the clitellum. You can see all the little segments. People will often ask, do worms have eyes? They don't have eyes, but they can sense light and dark. And that's important if you're a little creature that lives most of your time in the soil, because you know if you're in a light area, you're in danger. There's tons of things that'll eat worms, birds, lots of stuff eat them. So they're safer down in the soil. They can also dry out in the sun, so you definitely are going to want to know if you're in a light area, because that means you're in not a safe place if you're a worm. They do also sense movement really well and vibrations, and they kind of can sense chemical changes too, which is sort of their approximation of smelling. And then they have all those little hairs that you can't really see, the setae on them, that are important for how they move. So if you're looking at your worm, every worm has a couple different kind of muscles. They have circular muscles that go around the worm, and when they contract those, they lengthen out. And you might be seeing that with your worm a little bit. And then they also have longitudinal muscles which run the length of the worm, and when they contract those muscles, they shorten up and get all stubby. And so in order to move, though, they have to have those setae, those hairs, because otherwise they would just lengthen and shorten in the same place. But because they have the little hairs, what they can do is lengthen out, hold onto the soil with the tiny hairs that you can't see, and then pull their bottom end along forward. And then they can do the same thing, hold at the back end, so they'll lengthen forward, and they kind of move, inch themselves along that way. Oops. So slime is really important for worms because, like amphibians, they breathe through their skin. And unlike amphibians, they do not have lungs. So all of their breathing happens through their skin. So basically, if a worm dries out, it can't breathe and it dies. So it has to be able to keep moist because of that. And there are little pores on each segment that produce slime. And worms produce slime for breathing, also to help them move around through the soil better. And their slime is full of nitrogen, which is what makes worm castings or worm poop so great for your garden, because basically the food goes through, whatever they don't need gets clumped up within their digestive tract and coated with slime, which is covered with nitrogen. So then they poop it out, and you've got this little nitrogen pellet, basically, for your plants. They can also use slime for protection. So some of you, if you handle your worm quite a bit, sometimes you'll see like some yellow slime coming out of it. Did anybody see that? I don't know if anyone saw that. But it can make this yellow slime that's kind of stinky and it doesn't taste good, which is a defense mechanism. Some earthworms can actually shoot slime, which I know if an earthworm shot like me in the eye with some slime, I would probably drop it personally. These ones don't do that, though, don't worry. So here's a poor worm that dried out, and I know, poor worm, and also got cut here. So there is this idea that if you cut a worm in half, you get two worms, and that's not entirely true. So worms, not all earthworms, but some earthworms can regrow a new tail, but they can't regrow a head and the gizzard and the hearts and the clitellum. So if you cut a worm in half, it might be able to regrow a new tail, but it's not going to regrow the other side. So I've worked with kids in gardens where they've been chopping worms in half and being like, I'm making more worms. That's not true. And often, some of them do just flat out die if they get cut in half. Not all of them can regenerate a tail. So worms, these are two worms mating right up here. And worms are hermaphrodites. That means they have both male and female parts. A lot of small animals in the world are hermaphrodites, actually. So worms still will mate with another worm, and they exchange sperm. And what happens is one of these little yellow cocoons will form on the outside of the clitellum, and basically the worm wiggles out of it and deposits their eggs and the sperm from the other worm that they mated with into that cocoon. And then you have like 1 or 2 little baby worms that will hatch out of each cocoon. They're very small, tiny little things. And the lighter ones are fresher. The darker colored ones up there mean that it's an older cocoon and the worm's probably already hatched out and is gone. So there's different kinds of worms. There's worms that live up on the surface of the soil, and a lot of the ones that you guys are looking at are probably that kind. They live up in leaf litter. They're usually a darker red color for sun protection because they tend to be out in the sun more often because they're up at the surface. And then there's another kind of worm that's has very little pigment, and those ones are sort of the shallow soil dwellers, and they make tunnels horizontally in the soil. And then you've got the big, like, night crawlers, and they make these huge, long tunnels up and down in the soil, and they'll go very deep. So worms are really great for aerating soil and mixing it up and also moving nutrients. I mean, they poop and they add nitrogen, right? But they're also moving nutrients from high up in the soil to lower, and lower things, bringing it back up to the surface. So they're great for gardens and for farming. Here's a compost that has an explosion of worms going on. They can reproduce like crazy, the worms can. And here are some of those beautiful worm castings that are so great for gardens that you can go and buy in the store if you want. And yeah, worms are not, most of our earthworms are not native to North America. They were brought in by European settlers in like the 17th and 18th century, which is crazy. The North American earthworms pretty much all died out at the last ice age, which is a really weird fact because worms are everywhere right now. So you can't imagine that they wouldn't be native. Slugs and snails, so that's our next one here. They're also invertebrates. And what's the difference between a slug and snail? Oh, well, first, they're mollusks, which means soft-bodied creatures. And once again, most mollusks live in the ocean. Actually, about like a fourth of all the creatures, the life creatures in the ocean are some kind of mollusk. So it's a very big group of animals. The slugs and snails are gastropods, and gastro means stomach, and poda means foot. So they basically it means stomach foot, which is pretty appropriate for snails and slugs because they basically just move around on their little feet and they eat things, and that's mostly what they do in life. And be adorable, yeah, that's good. So nudibranchs are sea slugs. So once again, just with the gastropods, most of those live in the ocean too. But we're going to focus on our land snails. Nudibranchs, you can actually find these little ocean slugs in tide pools on the Oregon coast. So snails versus slugs, what's the difference? So snails have a shell. Slugs don't have a shell, although some slugs have like a weird residual shell, and so it gets kind of tricky actually telling them apart occasionally. The pro of a shell is that you have protection from predators and also from the elements. The good thing about not having a shell is that you can survive in areas where there's very little calcium in the soil. So slugs can actually survive in a lot more habitats than snails because they don't have that calcium requirement. But they're more susceptible to getting eaten, and they're more susceptible to like drying out or freezing or that kind of thing. So shells are really great for snails, and they can actually have this little epiphragm, this little door thing that they can close and close themselves in. They can breathe through it, it's porous. But the trivia question, the snail that was hibernating for 6 years, basically there was a scientist that had some snails that they had collected like on a shelf, right? And they accidentally introduced some moisture into the air, and the snail came out. It was collected 6 years prior, and all of a sudden the snail came out and started moving around. So they can wait a long time in their shell for conditions to be right for them to pop back out. That was a snail that lives in the desert, though, so I think it's used to waiting for moisture. I'm sure somebody has. That's the one that I've read about, but I'm sure there's more that have gone longer than that. That's the longest confirmed one. So for slugs, they have a mantle in replacing the shell.
Is that still a banana slug?
This is a banana slug. Yep, this one's a banana slug. They've got a keel on the top and a foot, which both slugs and snails have. They have that foot at the bottom. And then they've got tentacles at the top, and then slugs have a hole on one side that is where they breathe. So if you look up close at the tentacles, the top two tentacles on a slug or a snail are for vision. And they can't see very well, but they can kind of see basic shapes and stuff. And then the bottom two tentacles are for smelling. So that's how they're smelling things. And then there in the middle, you've got a mouth with the radula. And the radula is where all of those thousands of teeth are. They're very, very tiny. It's in a little circle. And just like a shark, they replace their teeth throughout their life because they're constantly wearing down. Yeah. And they eat like crazy. And you can actually, on quiet nights, you can hear them eat. Like, it's a loud sound. There's like a crunch, crunch, crunch. So here's some slugs here. Oh, and actually I forgot. I did bring some slugs and snails. So if anyone would like one of those on the table. I don't have as many of them. I couldn't find as many. Sorry, everyone. But you can raise your hand and we can give you a little slug or a snail to look at. Some of them are very tiny. Yeah, they're just different, a variety of slugs and snails that I found in my yard about an hour ago. So up here at the top, we can see a few different kinds of slugs that you might find around here. The top corner, the tail dropper, is a native one. It's one you probably haven't even noticed. They're very tiny, but they can, if something grabs them from behind, they can drop their tail, kind of like a lizard, to get away, and then they can regrow a new one. These other three are all non-native slugs. There's the giant garden slug over there. Giant garden slugs eat both all of your plants in your garden, and they eat native slugs. So they're omnivores, and they're predatory, and they will go after a lot of our native slugs and snails and eat them. They can move about 4 times faster than banana slugs. There's European furrowed slug right there, which also gets pretty big. And then there's the gray field slug, which is the kind that most of us have in our gardens. And they're known for having really milky white slime. And that's probably what you are going to get on your plate. If you decided to get one. So banana slugs are our native slug. They're the second biggest slug in the world, the largest slug in North America. And they're are 3 different kinds. Down in California, they have 2 varieties that are very light yellow, so they're kind of like the new banana. And around here, we have the old banana, which is more brown colored and often has black spots all over it. So those are our banana slugs. I don't bring banana slugs for presentations because they actually have a home territory, and if you take them out of it, they will get lost trying to get back to their home. So, and if you're a slug, it's very important to have a place that you know you can go to, like a little crevice in a tree or a hole in the ground where you can go to when conditions aren't good, when it gets too dry or it's too cold. So if you take them away from their territory, they can die because they can't find a spot to hide, basically. Banana slugs eat tons of different things. And it's important to realize that our native slugs and snails are adapted to eat like a lot of forest things out in our forest. And they're not really so much adapted to eat things in our gardens and our farms. Whereas the non-native stuff is totally adapted for eating all of our garden and farm produce. So usually if you have banana slugs anywhere near your yard, they're usually not very interested in our plants. They love mushrooms, they love lichens and mosses, they'll eat some plants in the forest. They'll also clean up dead leaves. And then there's one that's chowing down on some bear scat. So, and around here, I frequently see them on the sides of trails eating dog poop. And I had not seen that when I licked the banana slug, just so you know. Now that I've seen that, I would be a little more hesitant to lick banana slug. So here are some non-native snails. There's the brown garden snail, which is the one that was released brought in for escargot and then kind of took over. And then grove snail, which are often used in experiments because there's different markings on their shells, so it's easy to keep track of which snail is which. And then there's a garlic glass snail, and those ones can put off a really bad smell to avoid predators. And they're also predatory. So a lot of snails with the flat shells actually go after other snails and slugs and worms, and that's what they eat. And they've got that flat shell because they can get under things trying to chase their prey. You know, chase slowly. So these are some of our native snails. We've got the Pacific sideband, which are beautiful. They're really big and they're red. The whole thing is red and they're just gorgeous snails that live in the forest. And also Oregon forest snails. And there's the lance-toothed snail, called that because their radula their little teeth are harpoon-shaped, and they are predatory too. And they can actually worm themselves into another snail's shell and like basically harpoon it and pull it out and eat it. But they are native. So slime. Slime is really important for slugs. Slugs basically go through life surfing on slime. They're the original surfers. And they put down this big, thick layer. That's why you see like the layer that they leave behind. And they can go over really sharp things. People have done experiments having them go over like glass and stuff like that. No problem for slugs and snails. They really don't care. The other thing that they'll use it for, their slime for movement and also for defense. So if they think something's about to eat them, most of them have like either a slime that's like extra sticky or that smells bad or that tastes bad. And the reason why crazy people like me lick banana slugs is because they actually, on that slime, it has a slight numbing agent in it. So kids will lick it to see if they can make their tongue turn numb. That's why. I think it's I don't know. I think it mostly doesn't taste good. No, no, it hasn't been. I don't think it's good enough for numbing to use in dentistry. So here's a poor banana slug that got stepped on, and you can kind of see this extra white slime. That's what it puts out when it thinks it's about to die. It's like, don't eat me. Here's the really slimy slime. So slugs have really interesting and weird mating habits. And I wish I had a British accent for this, because then I could say whatever I wanted and it would be fine. So here are some slugs. Slug love. So slugs can mate for hours. This will go on for like a whole day, slug mating. Here, in case you couldn't see it, is the penis. Slugs are hermaphrodites, and they have very large genitalia for the size of their body. And they'll go around circling each other, waving their penises majestically in the air, and then circling each other and like giving each other little love bites, and then finally they mate. But it takes all day. This is a commitment on the slug's part. So slugs. So after all of that happens, then you end up with these little eggs that gardeners love to see in their garden, these little clear things that the slugs will hatch out of. Just like with the worms, slugs and snails don't take care of their young. They hatch out and they're on their own. Here's a little tiny baby slug. If it's a baby snail, it will have a tiny little shell, and the shell grows with the snail all through its life. Snails and slugs, yep, they're fun. Here's slime molds, and this is our last slimy thing. The slime molds are really weird things. No one really, like, scientists keep going back and forth like how to classify them. They used to be considered a fungus. They're not anymore. Now they're their own thing. This is the dog vomit one, and you can see that white part there, that's where it was, and it has moved. So they can move very slowly, but they do move. And what they are tiny little amoebas that hang out in the soil separately, and then there's something that seems to signal them, and there's still some debate on what that is. It could be like a lack of resources, or maybe it's time for them to reproduce. And they start joining together and form this giant slime mold that you can see. Some slime molds are big, some are little, and they all have crazy shapes and colors. Here's one that's called wolf's milk. So it makes these funny little balls. And when you poke them, this orange slime comes out of them. So if you're talking about something slimy, this is like the slimiest of the slimy things, basically, the slime molds. And what will happen is that orange will actually harden off after a while, and it will create spores. And the spores will be spread often by the wind. Sometimes by slugs or snails actually will spread them accidentally as they're moving around or eating them. So that's one kind, the wolf's milk. So some slime molds are, here's tapioca slime. Some can be big and really obvious, and some are much smaller. This tapioca one can get quite large and be pretty. If you saw that, you would know you were seeing it. They're very big. And some of them are, it's all the little amoebas are all joined together. And with some of them, they actually fuse and form one giant cell with a whole bunch of little nuclei within it. So there's different kinds of slime mold, how they do that. Some of them make these awesome shapes, like these chocolate tubes. Like just the craziest thing. They're very photogenic, the slime molds. And here's one that doesn't have a common name, but it's these funny, tiny little orangey balls that you'll see like on the sides of tree or on dead wood. And slime molds, if you try to separate them, they will come back together, and they often send out runners. And people have done some really awesome experiments with the slime molds. They're very efficient at finding food. And so what they're eating are like bacteria, yeast, little tiny things like that in the soil is what they're looking for to eat. And they'll actually send out these runners. And in some experiments people have done, they have mimicked interstate highway systems of countries, because that's the most efficient way to find food. You can see videos of it online. They're really cool to watch. But they're really good at finding food, and eventually they'll all send out spores, and those will float in the wind, and that's how they reproduce. So Slimo, it's pretty cool. Do I have anything else? And that's it. That was our last one of the slimy things. So thank you, everyone. Questions? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Uh-huh. Oh, worm bin. Uh-huh. Oh, no. So worm bins, usually people who make worm bins are using red wiggler worms because they don't make tunnel systems, so they don't mind being confined. And they'll just eat your stuff. But no, you can put them outside in leaf litter and stuff, and they'll be perfectly happy. They'll find a place to go. Yeah. Yeah.
Should I murder non-indigenous slugs and snails?
What?
Should I murder non-indigenous slugs?
Should you murder non-indigenous slugs and snails? You know, I'm okay if you do that, personally. Yeah. You know, the non-native ones actually sometimes eat our native slugs and snails, and they do kind of live in a different habitat because they tend to just hang out in our yards and not go into the forest as much. But sometimes when they do, it can cause problems for our native slugs and snails. Yeah. So you shouldn't feel bad about it, I guess. Not really. I mean, they're sometimes good at spreading like spores of different plants and stuff, so they can do that. But for your garden, not so much. There's not a lot of benefits. Yeah. Oh yes. Yes, the Pacific tree frogs are native to Oregon. Yeah. Sometimes they're called Pacific chorus frogs also, so that can be kind of confusing. Oh, you know, I don't know. I don't know. I hadn't heard that, but it could be. Oh, yeah, I haven't heard about that, so I don't know. So there's an invasive frog in Hawaii that's causing problems, and it could easily be one from the Northwest. I don't know. But there are a lot of different kinds of tree frogs in the world. And actually, our Pacific tree frog is less like a tree frog than most tree frogs, which is why they have thought about changing the name to Pacific chorus frog instead. Their life cycle is a little bit, the way they live their life is a little different than the majority of tree frogs in the world. So probably it's a different one, but I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Do you know? Oh, I'm sorry. Is there an open season on killing or eating bullfrogs? I don't know. I don't think so. I think you can kind of take them anytime you want. What? Yes. They would be the people to ask. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
I could ask like 5 questions. How do you know the difference between a native, like, how often do you see a native earthworm?
Oh, so how often do you see a native earthworm versus a European earthworm? Very rarely. Almost all the worms that you see are non-native. Yeah. There are a few native ones mixed in, but pretty much most of the ones you're seeing in your yard and around are all the non-natives.
Why did all the North American worms die off?
Why did all the North American worms die off? I don't know if they really know the answers to that question. It just seems like they died off at the last ice age. Conditions, I guess, weren't right, or they weren't able to deal with the cold, perhaps. Yeah. Oh, how old do slugs and snails get? Banana slugs can live to be about 5 or 6 years. So probably a lot of smaller slugs and snails are living a lot less than that. But yeah, around that, 5 or 6 years I can. Yeah. Oh, I just call them that. So she was asking about the old banana versus the new banana with the banana slug. I just call them that. There's 3 different kinds of banana slugs, and the one that we have here that kind of, it just looks like an old banana, it's actually Columbianus or something. So it's named after the Columbia River, the Latin name. Oh yeah, so slugs and snails do hibernate over the winter time. Usually, I mean, if you're a snail, you can just go into your shell, right? And they all have antifreeze properties, so if they get frozen, it's okay. They'll de-thaw and be fine. But slugs, what they'll have to do is hide, like, down in an old rodent burrow or something, sometimes under some rocks or something to protect themselves. But same thing, they can freeze too, but they're not going to be out during frozen conditions. Yeah, too cold for them. So they do hibernate. Yeah, so if anyone wants to look, I'll have them up here. I did bring a few of our freshwater leeches that you could look at. And then I also brought a few shells of some of our native snails. So I'll maybe bring those up to the front, and if you want to come check them out, you are welcome to do that. But yeah, thank you, everyone.